Welcome back to Storytime. In today's episode, we're going to be reading stories using the prompt, "You are a B-list superhero on the verge of losing your job. During a battle with a villain, you accidentally end up killing one of the more prolific superheroes of your time. That's when you realize that with your niche power that was useless as a hero, you could be an A-list villain." Today's story comes from user Turnaround0101's. To get this out of the way first, superheroes are the Neo-Puritans. From the day one at the academy when they sit you down in an orientation class called The Way of the Hero, to week 2 when Way of the Hero becomes Self-Image 101, you're immediately assailed by a tyrannical value system that demands that you fit into their little magazine-ready box. Some of them get to be a little bit more risque, of course. There's the Superheroine Swimsuit Edition and the Everyday Heroes calendar where all the guys dress up like firemen and cops that somehow lost their shirts. But every other day of the year, they hand you the stupid wide-brimmed hat and expect you to be a good little girl like all the rest. Not that we actually have to wear hats. That would have been the worst. But the capes they issued weren't flattering at all. You couldn't even pick your superhero name. That was class 2, right at the end of your first year after they decide you've grown into yourself enough to be issued an identity. I remember standing in line, all wide eyes and giddy excitement when the names were called. The girl 2 places in front of me got Sapphire Surfer. The guy right behind me was dubbed the Human Hurricane. It took one look at my wide eyes and apparent adorable excitement and named me Little Sister. Had I wanted to kill the smug, portly little man behind the desk whose name tag read The Eternal Flame and whose powers couldn't have been anything better than sparking eternal annoyance? Absolutely. Did I? No. I'd just written a 50-page paper on the self-control and the 5 tenets of heroism, and not a single one of those tenets said anything about acting for yourself or having an urge. But I had them all the same, and right up until I killed my first man, I tried to push my feelings down just like I did the day they labeled me Little Sister and made me take it like an idiot. Allow me to set the stage. It was a late night, June 13th, 2025, on the mean and shoddily lit streets of Newest York. We worked at Teams that night, and, being considered an inveterate screw-up and a complete underachiever by the management, I'd been paired with the Emerald Architect, the man who was able to literally will super weapons into existence with the power of his mind when he was younger, but now only seemed to live on a plane where all that mattered were the shining green parlor tricks he conjured up for his Friday night TV show. However diminished I thought he was then, I still had a certain wide-eyed, one of the more common states in those days, admiration. He was a legend of the business, and if anyone could get me into shape and actually finish a job, it would be him. He'd taken one look at me and asked, "Little sister, huh? Do you actually have a power?" Which stung like hell. "Of course I have a power," I said. "I'm a charmer."
"Ah, that makes sense with the name. More of a soother or a deceiver?" he asked.
"A little of both, I suppose. I'm still figuring out how I should actually use it in combat. So far I've been able to glamour henchmen, and that's useful enough. I took every unarmed combat course the Academy had to offer and aced them, so mostly I stick to mowing down the jobbers while other people handle the big bad." The Emerald Architect stroked at his long, wispy beard thoughtfully, the deeply hewn lines of his face twisting over what to do with me.
"Senor Shrink doesn't have henchmen, unfortunately. They have an awful tendency of ending up an inch tall and squished. The underworld has stopped working with him."
I sighed and shook my head. I'd fallen somewhat since graduation. This wasn't at all what I'd imagined. "I'll figure something out, though. Maybe I can soothe the crowd that would have gotten in the way when you try to bring him in." The architect chuckled, putting his outstretched hand in front of his face and then blowing into it. A long emerald stream erupted from his mouth, soaring through the air and forming itself into a low retaining wall across a nearby alley.
"I think I can handle crowd control," he said,
doting at me as he snapped his fingers, dismissing the wall. I hated him for it. Well, then, just what am I supposed to do? I needed this job. I needed it to go off with a hitch. I needed a reporter to snap a picture of me next to a prone, handcuffed Senor Shrink, and looked completely amazed that anyone, especially some B-tier nothing named Little Sister, could have brought him in. I needed the Emerald Architect to be so amazed by my skills that he went back to the office and recommended me for a promotion, a raise, and a sidekick of my very own who could snap cars in half with his little finger. I needed...
There's a coffee shop down the street. You could start by getting me one of those.
My jaw dropped open. My heart fell out of my chest, and any hope that the night was going to go well went up in smoke. He wanted me to get him a coffee? The Emerald Architect tossed a $50 coin at me. He was just showing off at this point, and I stuffed it into the pocket of my ugly, shapeless suit, turned and trudged off to the coffee shop.
Heroes, it is I, Senor Sheik.
A shrill, too-high voice shouted from above us. A tall, lanky man in a black one-piece stood on the street light above us, a sci-fi movie-looking ray gun in his left hand.
You thought you could defeat me. You thought you could end my reign of terror. But nobody stops the shrink. In the end, your nightmares come for you just the same.
Senor Shrink pointed the ray gun at his feet and fired. Striking the lamp pole, began rapidly shrinking into the ground until it was barely inches tall. He stepped off casually. He had an incredibly stupid name and an incredibly stupid power. But I had to admit, that was one of the best entrances I'd ever seen.
Step back, sis. I'll handle this fiend.
The Emerald Architect's cape blew back in a sudden breeze. He still looked old, but a dashing old now, as his powers surrounded him. Bright green magic flying from his lips. It formed into a massive emerald hammer in his hand, and he charged, screaming something inarticulate. Senor Shrink's height cut itself in half from approximately 6'3", and the hammer sailed harmlessly over his head.
No man defeats Senor Shrink.
He shot back up to his normal height, dodged past the Architect's too slow attempt to grapple, and pointed his ray gun squarely at me.
Sis, no!
The Architect shouted. A stream of magic shot from his lips just ahead of the ray gun's burst and formed itself into a wall in front of me. Time seemed to slow down. It was as if I could see the shot that would ruin me coming. It flew forward, piercing the shield, changing, somehow shifting on the color spectrum from black to gray. It hit me and something curious happened. I felt a strange tightening all over my body, my hips, my waist, my chest, everywhere. I jumped back in shock and terror, waiting for the world to shift around me, resigning myself to live the rest of my life as a Gulliver's Travels reenactor. But then I realized the Emerald Architect wasn't looking at me in terror anymore. There was something else in his eyes, something almost feral. Senor Shrink, too. His smug look of victory was gone, replaced with an unhinged jaw. I looked down at myself and gasped. I felt like a brand new woman. The hideous, formless super suit I'd been issued was gone, replaced by something that hugged me in all the right places. I moved, and it felt like a second skin. I listened to the swishing of my cape across the ground, and when I reached back, I found it had shrunk too, ending at my lower back now instead of hanging all the way down, constantly wrapping around my legs whenever I tried to do anything. And the looks they gave me. Architect, are you okay?
Are you still... You can't be...
Alarmed, I reached out to him with my power, trying to pour goodwill towards me into him. Whatever had just happened, I couldn't have him thinking I was corrupted or something now. His review to management was the only thing that would get my contract renewed. I needed this badly, and I poured on the heat, leaning towards him, trying to win over a man who was staring at me in a way that made no sense at all. He gasped and grabbed at his heart, falling to his knees. All the green magic evaporated, fading away like so much smoke, and he collapsed face first onto the ground. Did I do that? I asked, shocked.
You! What are you? Who are you?
Senor Shrink shrieked. I'm little sister. I'm a charmer. Did I do that? I didn't mean to do that.
Little sister!
The man said, guffawing.
Then the heroes must be blind.
He crouched down next to the Emerald Architect, feeling for a pulse, and then shaking his head.
I think you blew up the old fool's heart. Way to go.
I didn't mean to.
It still happened.
Senor Shrink stowed his ray gun in his belt, walking over to me.
Somehow I don't think the higher-ups will have you back after this.
I nodded sadly, staring at the Architect's body. I'd killed a man, and I wasn't even sure how.
There are, however, other paths.
Senor Shrink leaned in close. His breath was bad. He needed deodorant.
The world of villains takes all comers. You'll find we aren't so reserved as your heroic siblings.
He chuckled, and it made me want to punch him.
Myself, I could use a sidekick.
Without thinking about it, I grabbed him by the neck and hurled him over my hip, judo style. He smashed into the ground like a bunch of bricks, and I put him into a headlock.
I'm done with being a goddamn sidekick,
I hissed. If I'm turning, let's get one thing straight. You're the sidekick now. He nodded as best he could with my arm clamped around his throat. I was going to leave it behind. All of it. There wasn't much choice now that the architect was dead. I felt strange. Different in a way. I couldn't explain. Little sister was dead too. I let go of him, pushing Senor Shrink away from me. Call me Twisted Sister, I said.